I'd like to welcome Alan Jope to the stage for our next event. Of a slightly different format here, we're going to, rather than a speech, we're going to have a wee chat.
Good idea.
I thought we'd better begin, just to clarify for the audience that we're not going to spend the next 15 minutes fighting over a comb.
Yes, well, it's a good look, Eddie.
It is a good look, yeah. But so that clarified. Let's get on to the kind of the business. Alan, we're really privileged, delighted that you've made it here today. For those of you who don't know, I'm sure most of you do, Alan's one of Scotland's most renowned international business figures, former CEO of Unilever, having joined in 1985, I believe, as a graduate marketing trainee. He rose to become its global chief executive, serving for 5 years until this summer. A few years ago, Alan was also a student here at University of Edinburgh Business School, so as well as welcoming him here today on your behalf, this is very much a case of welcome home.
Thanks, Eddie.
And Alan was very generous
Always
last night.
Always a Glaswegian, I must confess.
But it was very generous last night in entertaining us as local as well in the new town, so it was a pleasure. Alan, we're going to talk a little bit today for the next 15 minutes or so about your views on the kind of mission, the social purpose of business and the private sector. But before we get into that, can I just ask, I know what you've made of what you've heard of today, as somebody that is a Scot, spend a lot of time outside of Scotland. What do you bring to what we've heard from today?
Well, I must say, I am a very proud Scot, and I'm very proud to be here today on St Andrew's Day. I think we should be celebrating and recognising that. Gordon began with a very harsh dose of reality that our growth rate has been so pitiful compared with, take the United States as a benchmark. On the other hand, we've heard a lot of optimism, and if I've learned one thing in 38 years of business, it is focus, focus, focus. Focus your strategy, and just when you think you've focused and can't focus anymore, focus a wee bit more. And the agenda that's been laid out where Scotland picks, I'm most excited about the industrial sector choices. And the idea of Glasgow having a differentiated expertise from Edinburgh, from Aberdeen, from Dundee, and really building that up is utterly exciting and will be the platform for successful growth of Scotland. But I was despondent when I heard about the infrastructure problems for the BioQuarter. When I was working in China, we wanted to build a factory in Tianjin, and we sat down with the Tianjin local authority, and almost before the conversation was finished, they were driving a road into the space, they were laying down utilities, they were throwing incentive money at us, and it's a one-stop shop. You know who to talk to, it gets done fast. And similarly, someone mentioned Singapore. I still sit on the Singapore Economic Development Board's Advisory Council, and the Singapore EDB, when they decide that a sector is a priority, the money is going to flow. And when the sector is not a priority, the money's not going to flow. They're just focused and decisive. And I think Singapore and China are two jurisdictions we can learn from as we look to accelerate Scotland's growth.
Sorry, it's really interesting what you say. I mean, do you feel that this is a kind of a Western problem, if you like, or at least a European problem? You talk about two countries there, emerging economies, or in Singapore's case, already having emerged, but Asian economies, if you like, there's that sense of, we are just going to go out there and grab that business. And
no, I think Scots and Chinese are more alike than Scots and English.
Right.
So I wouldn't hide behind that at all. I think what it is both countries have a sense of urgency. Singapore was a swamp 50 years ago. China was destitute in 1949, and there's this urgency for development, and that's the spirit we have to capture. Scots are good at that kind of thing. So no, I wouldn't say it's to do with your ethnicity. I think it's to do with a sense of urgency.
It's not so much ethnicity so much as just a cultural thing, as you say, that we've got. So let me ask you a little bit about your time at Unilever and the kind of leadership ethic that you instilled there. The conference today, it's not just about how do we get economic growth, it's also about how do we use that to tackle poverty and inequality. And I know this is something you're very passionate about too. So I wonder if could you explain to us a little bit about how at Unilever you applied that in practice in terms of your wage policy, your relationship with suppliers, and your branding, for example?
Sure. Look, the world has got a number of very, very significant problems that we're facing right now. And I believe there's 3 big ones that business has got a role in solving, which is the climate emergency, the loss and destruction of nature, and the rising and rampant inequality coupled with persistent poverty. Those are existential threats to the world, but therefore to business. They're business risks. And they're problems that are so massive and overwhelming that they cannot be solved by one country and they cannot be solved by one sector. You do need the regulatory power of government. By the way, I think we might need some new intergovernmental institutions. But you then also need the inventiveness of academia, the moral conscience of civil society, and the drive that the private sector can bring to get things done if we're going to solve those problems. So I see business very much at the center of solving these biggest problems that the world faces. But this is the single most important point I'd like to try and land, is that cannot be a moral imperative. It's not because it's the right thing to do. It's also not, it cannot be greenwashing, painting over our sins. It can't be a marketing exercise. It only makes sense if there's a strong business case. Come back to that in a second. So Unilever has taken a lot of action to help on climate, on nature. But let me talk a little bit about inequality. I would have thought, you're going to hear later about something called a living wage, or we call it a fair living wage, which is the idea that you pay people enough money to house themselves, clothe themselves, feed themselves, educate their children, and get themselves to work. And it's not much above the minimum wage, but it's a bit above the minimum wage in most countries. And we assumed that everyone in Unilever would be making a fair living wage, and it turned out they were not. There were pockets in the world where we were paying people below this fair wage. And we changed that. It took us 18 months. And then we'd made a decision and that impacts about 150,000 people who work for Unilever. But we felt that wasn't enough. So we made a commitment that anybody who wanted to be a supplier to Unilever by 2030 needed to make the commitment today that by 2030 their value chain would pay a fair living wage. Now, I was a bit worried about that because some of the agricultural partners that we work with, I thought they would say, well, we can't commit to higher costs. But it's amazing how quickly people have come on board around the world because people understand that paying people properly generates lower turnover of staff, higher productivity, stronger loyalty, and stronger consumer markets. So we don't see this as a cost at all. We see it as an investment. And I don't know who would want to build their business on poverty wages. I certainly wouldn't want to.
Let me play the kind of devil's advocate a little bit here, because you've said there that this isn't about, a kind of tick box exercise. It's actually integral to, as you would see it, a successful business case. I'm thinking about maybe companies listening to that and saying, yeah, all very well, but I've got my quarterly results coming up and I need to be able to show that I'm turning a decent profit. Yep. And and that profit margin presumably will get cut into if you start paying staff extra, all the rest of it. So the devil's advocate argument here is, yeah, that's all very nice and all very well, but a cynic might say you're being too idealistic.
Okay, let me try to persuade you. And I heard there was a gentleman earlier said he advises companies on decarbonisation. So do please feel to grab the mic and back me up if you agree with what I'm about to say. So I think the business case for sustainability rests on 4 platforms, and I'll try and illustrate them. And they are growth, cost, risk, and talent. So consumers of today, and particularly consumers of tomorrow, really care about where they're spending their pound. And Kantar, a big market research firm around the world, have studied many, many product categories and have observed over 10 years that brands which make a sustainable claim around the environment or society are outgrowing the rest of that category 2 to 1. Unilever has similar data. Just over 50% of Unilever's brands are seen by consumers as doing something positive for society or the planet, and they're outgrowing the rest of the portfolio by a multiple. And so I think this is quite simply, if you want to be a successful, future-facing business and want to remain relevant, You have to make choices that people want to buy into, and this will be increasingly a discriminator for people on the brands that they choose. Secondly, yes, perversely, recycled plastic costs more than virgin plastic. Sustainably grown palm oil costs more than conventionally grown palm oil. But net, through sustainable sourcing, Unilever saved 1.3 billion euros over the last 8 years, largely by making an early and aggressive move into renewable energy and being obsessed with reducing our carbon footprint. So this paradigm that sustainability costs you money, yes, sometimes it does, but there are ways to see sustainability as a saving. I'll fast track through the other 2 points. Risk. A world that's underwater or on fire or rife with social uprising is not a great place for selling ice cream or soup or video games. And the last point is young people want to join companies whose values align with their own. Unilever has a graduate recruitment program in 52 countries around the world. 8 years ago, we were the employer of choice in 17 of those 52 countries. Last year, we were the employer of choice in 50 of 52 countries, and we know it for sure it's the values of the company and the work that we're doing. So if you want to attract the best and brightest talent, you better be clear on what your position is on these important world problems. Yeah. And that's the business case we think.
No, and how is that when you speak to fellow CEOs, when you go around boardrooms around the world, how is that argument, how does that land?
Let me answer by quoting from a more discriminating audience, which is the capital markets.
Right.
So early in my tenure as CEO, I made the error of sharing with the capital markets Unilever's commitment to sustainability, but forgetting to explain the business case. I can tell you over the last 5 years, not one investor has criticized us for this, but BlackRock beat a path to our door saying, can you help us? How do we coach other companies that we're invested in on how to decarbonize? Legal & General beat a path and said, can you help us on how do we get our other companies that we're investing in to source their agricultural components sustainably? We got a lot of questions from investors about fair living wage, and always with the impetus of do more, go faster. So I think 10 years ago, this was a niche view that there was a business case for sustainable business. Now it's absolutely mainstream and gathering momentum.
Okay. You've had, I think, 4 months since
Yes.
of peaceful retirement. I'm not sure that's the right word, given how much you've taken on and told us about last night. But you've had a little bit...
I keep finding myself helping Gordon out on his various ventures, to be honest.
Don't we all? But you've had a little chance in this time to reflect on the 5 years you had at the absolute top. And I wonder, for the benefit of the audience here, fellow business people in the audience, about what you might have done differently, what mistakes you feel you've made, and what advice you might give to people.
Well, we've got 2 minutes, 49 seconds left. That's not enough to cover a tiny proportion of the mistakes that I made. So I'll restrict myself to the mistakes that I made on the subject of sustainable business, the topic that I'm kind of advocating for now. The first was not to be explicit on the business case, that this is not charity, it's not a moral imperative, it's a business imperative. The more we leaned into that, the more traction we got. The second mistake we made was we spread our agenda too wide. And then in the recent year or so, we've really narrowed our focus on decarbonizing Unilever, addressing our plastic waste footprint, which is horrible, sustainable sourcing of agricultural materials, and paying people properly in our value chain. And as we bring focus, I guess preaching my own kind of words, the more we focus, the more traction we've got. That was a mistake to go too wide. The other mistake we made was to stray into areas that business has no business getting into. So our friends at Ben & Jerry's decided they would take a view on the position in the Middle East and started criticizing Israel. And Ben & Jerry's have got certain rights in the acquisition agreement that they can do things like that. But I wish I'd reined them in more aggressively, because leave the geopolitics to the politicians. And the last point is a new thought for me, actually, which is there's this anti-woke backlash happening, which I think is driven by some of the extreme positions on the diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda. Now, don't get me wrong, I care deeply about diversity, equity, and inclusion. But companies getting drawn into the outer fringes of, how many is it right that there's 70 different gender descriptions? Getting criticized for being in that space, it takes away the focus from the hard-edged business practices. So those are just a few of many mistakes that I made.
Not too many. And maybe, as you say, we're running out of time, but maybe I could finish a little bit where we began, which was the subject of this conference and the question of Scottish economic growth. You spent a fair bit of time here. You were here over lockdown, I know, but obviously you spent a long time outside of Scotland. Now that when you're looking back here, I'd like to ask you about the branding of Scotland. What should brand Scotland be as we go into this, as we've heard from others, incredibly competitive global marketplace? How do we get noticed, a small country like this?
So, we were talking about this last night. I think as Scots, we all know how beloved our country is around the world. I can't wait when people say, where are you from? On my kind of 28 years living outside of the UK, I couldn't wait to get out that I was from Scotland. And there's a deep love and respect for our country. We're pretty good at beating ourselves up, but people know the amazing role, punching way above our weight, that Scotland has played in the world. People know about the beauty of Scotland's natural assets. People know about the character of Scottish people, and we should be more proud of all of that. And we need to go back to the 19th century when Scotland was inventing the modern world and everything in it. We have the opportunity to reinvent the future world that Chris was talking about in information technology and precision medicine, in green energy and transport. Let's just pick these safe bets on the industries of the future and re-establish Scotland's reputation as a pioneer. We can do it.
Fantastic. Can I ask just one last question? What next, Alan? I mean, is it Scotland rugby manager, or are you going to take over from Alan Sugar at The Apprentice?
Yeah, I'm going to start a hairdressing chain. Thank you very much.
Right. Well, that's it. We'll end there. But can I just thank, on your behalf, Alan Jope, for fantastic. Thanks.